Hey everyone, and welcome to our second week of our new series, Fear Factor. And if you were with us last week, we looked at the foundation of fear and how fear really impacts our lives. And we looked at how fear is this complete belief that overwhelms us and oftentimes impacts our thoughts, our actions, and our responses. So we closed out last week looking at how we are not given to a spirit of fear, and knowing that as our place as children of God, we have this power to overcome fear. And over the next couple of weeks, I want to take a look at two fears that all of us really struggle with at one point or another. And as we look at this, I think if we're really all honest, we can see these fears in our lives in some way or another. And today I want to start off with looking at the fear that's one of the most common forms, and that's the fear of failure. And how many of you guys have ever failed at something, right? Or you've had a situation when you were a kid where something happened and it created this fear in you because of this ongoing residual thing that happened one time long ago. And personally, I love to dream and I love to think about things that I want to accomplish, and things that I want to do someday. I've thought, about doing businesses and all these adventures and all these other things. But sometimes fear or the fear of failing at things stop us from doing it. And I remember one time I was working in sales management. I had just returned home from spending several months traveling and being away from my kids, from Anna. Actually, it was before I had kids, so it was being away from Anna. And during this time of traveling, we saved quite a bit of money because I was gone all the time. And the idea was that this money was going to be set aside to help Anna pay for Anna's school. And I remember this seems silly now, but I remember at the time thinking about it and really feeling this led to invest in this certain stock and in this specific place. And silly, right? Like, who has that kind of instinct or that feeling? But I had this strong feeling I was supposed to do it, and I just couldn't get out of my head. But something held me back. I was like, no, that's Anna's money for her school. And so the fear of failing and losing all that money kept me from doing it. And so over the next couple of weeks, I watched the stock quadruple in a short amount of time. Quadruple, and I missed out on this moment. And so this is kind of a stupid example, admittedly, but there's numerous times in life where we feel like we're supposed to do something and we don't take the risk because we're afraid that we will fail. And as people, failure is really a part of life, right? We've all blown it. We've all messed up. We've all fallen flat on our face more than once. I have two kiddos, as most of you know. As babies, they're really resilient in the face of failure, right? My infant, she'll fall all the time trying to do stuff, and she just keeps getting up and keeps trying. And how many of you guys have ever been around a baby trying to learn how to walk, right? They fall a lot, but they have a lot of failures, but they just get right back at it. The problem is that the older we get, the less capacity we seem to have for failure. And it really happens at a young age. It all affects us all differently. But my son, who's now 5, there are times that he'll try something and fail, and he just breaks down and refuses to try again because he messed up. And he lets failure impact him differently than my 5-month-old. And I don't think this is isolated to my house. Studies have found that failure has a very short learning curve. We learn it really early on, and this fear of failure. And the reality is that failure is just not a great feeling, right? If you've ever failed, most people just don't love that feeling. And it's a lot like that kid that puts their hand on the stove and gets burned. You learn that lesson really quick, right? We don't like the sting of failure, and we don't like that it affects our lives and that affects the way we feel. And so we just stop putting ourselves out there because of that danger of failing. And over time is that we develop this fear of failure. And it's this fear that keeps us from taking risk or from taking a chance because of that fear that we'll fail. And it keeps us from trying certain things because of this self-preservation that happens. And it keeps us really from persevering and pushing through times that we fail because we don't want that pain of failure. So things that maybe we want to try to do, and it takes a long time to learn how to do, but after a couple of failures, we just stop doing it because the pain and the pressure of that's just too much. And so today I want to take a couple minutes, and I want to look at the way that we can interact with that fear and really confront it head on. And what happens is that we can begin to change failure and the fear of failure as a starting point, and instead of making it a last place, we can make it a starting point to where God's calling us to go. And I want you to hear this today. You will never get to where God's calling you to get if you allow fear of failure to define the way you respond. As we've talked about several times, being one who trusts God often means taking risk, even the risk of failure. And the truth is that every time, failure is not meant to be a final destination. It's often a first step towards a success. I love what the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12. He says, he's writing to the church in Corinth, and he says, I've learned to boast in my weaknesses. I've learned to brag about the places I failed because I know in those places God's grace is made complete. In other words, failure doesn't keep me from moving forward because I know God is still working, and it's meant to keep him in the places, keep him from residing in those places of failure. And he's meant to meet him in those places. And we can hear about this all the time, like the pioneers of society and the pioneers of science are often the ones that have the greatest capacity or the greatest endurance for failure. They fail time and time and time and time again, and they let those be lessons of what not to do instead of end points that say, I just can't do it, I give up, right? The only people that are ever disqualified in those places are the ones that just give up. And these people, these pioneers, are the ones that time and time again have perseverance and resilience in the face of failure and refuse to quit. The second thing I want to say is failure does not define you. And I want you to hear that. Like, failure does not define you. Failure is merely an event that occurs in a process. You are not a failure. You may have failed. There might be places where you've messed up, but that does not define you. You are not defined. You're not, who you are is not made up of all your failures. You are not a failure. Failure is an event, not a person. And when we allow ourselves to let failures be what makes us up, and not use these places as places to grow, and we use these places of personal identification, we begin to lock ourselves in. You are not defined by your failure. We have to allow ourselves the opportunity to fail, because if we no longer allow ourselves that opportunity, then we'll never get to places we've never been before, right? And when we know that we're not defined by failures, it no longer impacts our personal perception, we can begin to build a resilience in the face of failure. And if I'm looking for somebody that's really going to make an impact in the world, I can guarantee you one thing: they've experienced failure. Guaranteed. And what's unique about these people is that they have often created a culture in their world where failure becomes part of the process. It becomes part of their lives. And they begin to look forward to these places of failures because they know that change and growth comes out of these. The only time failure becomes a problem is when you allow it to stop you from moving towards God. Either staying in that cycle of failure or never trying because of that pain and that fear of failure. In Hebrews, the book talks a lot about faith and the impact that faith has on our lives as followers of God. And in chapter 6, we find that Paul says this: God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown him as you have helped his people and continue to help them. We want each of you to show this same diligence to the very end, so that what you hope for may be fully realized. Failure requires a resilience and a diligence to keep pressing through. And he goes on to say, we don't want you to become lazy, but to imitate those that through faith and patience inherit what was promised them. Failure requires a patience. It requires a diligence. It requires a perseverance. And the people that I admire the most are the ones that have this perseverance and this diligence to push past failure and the fear of failure. They're the ones that are seeing fulfillment of what they hoped for because they're able to not stop in that place. They're able to say failure does not create the whole identity of what's happening. Fear of failure can keep you at the starting line if you let it. It lets you keep you from ever getting started because I might mess up, so I don't even want to take that risk. Never taking a risk or never taking a chance, or you can either live in that place or it can be the force that drives you to success, right? So fear can cause you to never take the risk or never take a chance. Or in the end, it can really be that thing that drives you forward. And so I understand that's scary, and I understand that's really hard to know that and to live in that place. But I know that with every failure, a lesson can be learned, and every lesson leads to success. So today, if you hear nothing else, hear this: that the fear of failure really impacts us all. We've all dealt with it at a certain time. But learning to use it as a tool will lead you to following the call of God, or it can cause you to never start. The choice is really yours on where you want to go with that. So think about your life and think about a risk or a call that you feel God may have placed on your life, a dream that you might wonder if you could ever happen. And ask yourself, what's the next right step towards God that would lead to unlocking that dream or that risk? What risk can I take even in the face of failure? Because you will fail. And sometimes that feels very much like a death sentence, but in the end, I'm convinced that you can come out stronger for it. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next week.